Let's look at language acquisition and how it applies to young learners in an elementary immersion program. The first thing parents need to be aware of is that there are two different ways to pick up a new language. One way is language acquisition, and the other way is language learning. These are very different processes. Both of these processes can lead to fluency, but the pathway to get there is going to look a little different. Immersion in the target language can be helpful in both of these processes. In fact, current research would suggest that the best way to pick up a language is through immersion, regardless of which process you use. However, immersion is required for the language acquisition process, but only optional for the language learning process. Now, as a language immersion parent, it's really important that you understand the differences in the processes, because many of us will judge our child's language progress through the lens of language learning when they are in fact going through the process of language acquisition. So let's look at the differences. Language acquisition occurs most often in young learners. That's because it's based on brain wiring that we lose as we get older. So we all learned our first language through the language acquisition process. In order to understand the steps of this process, all we really need to do is think about how our children learned to speak their first language. Language learning occurs later in life, usually through a specific teaching environment. Maybe, for example, you took a second language in high school. That would be an example of language learning. Language acquisition is a very subconscious process. Children don't realize that they are learning a language, and they aren't really mapping their language progress. On the flip side, in language learning, the learner is very aware of their learning. Acquiring language forms a grammatical feel. This means that phrases will just sound right or sound wrong, but your child may not know why. We do this all the time in our first language. Something just doesn't sound quite right, so we keep trying until it does. But we may not even know the rule that makes it right once we get it right. In contrast, learning a language results in knowing the grammar rules and consciously applying them. As a side note, this can be something that trips up immersion parents. You might hear your children making grammatical errors and wanting to explain the rules. But this might not make much sense to your child, as they are not usually explicitly taught grammar rules until about second grade. Instead, they learn grammar organically. They're simply corrected by the teacher, but the rule is not explained. Similarly, you would not stop to explain to your 2-year-old why we say he jumps and not he jump. You would just repeat the phrase correctly, and over a period of time, the child will just adjust and start using the proper grammar. All right, next category. Acquiring a language results in better fluency and communication. A lot of this is because when you are acquiring a language, you acquire the soft skills that come with that language. These skills allow you to read between the lines and speak in a way that communicates more clearly what you want to say. When you're learning a language, it results in a lot more knowledge about the language and its structures, but not necessarily some of those softer skills. This doesn't mean that you can't learn to communicate well if you learn a language. It just means that you might have to work harder to learn the nuances of that language. Next, in acquired language, your child is faster to understand meaning because your child isn't trying to tie new vocabulary to vocabulary they already know. They're just soaking up the new terms. The benefit of this is that your child can understand what's being said very quickly. The drawback is that it comes at the cost of speech. So speaking the language comes later in language acquisition than it does with language learning. In language learning, we learn to speak as we learn to understand. As a result, we can correlate our ability to speak the language with our knowledge of that language, which you can't do in language acquisition. So this is one of the big issues that comes up with immersion kiddos. A lot of their parents want to know, when will my child speak the language? Because they equate the ability to speak language with the ability to understand language. And that's just not the case in language acquisition. In fact, there's often a 1 to 2 year gap between your child's ability to understand and your child's ability to speak. We see this in toddlers. We can speak to a toddler and they can understand us, but they can't produce that same level of language when communicating with us. And in fact, that's often what causes their tantrums, because not being able to communicate is hard. Lastly, both of these are going to depend on a certain level of aptitude. We acquire language with a certain aptitude, and we learn language with a certain aptitude. Now, some people might be able to learn a language very quickly. Some people might go through the process of acquiring a language very slowly. So it's based a lot on the learner's natural language abilities. The big takeaway here for parents is that acquiring language is a much quieter process than learning a language. There's a lot of underground work going on, and it can take almost 2 years before we get to really see the fruits of that labor coming out in their ability to speak. So give your child a little bit of grace as they're in the first 2 years of their language program. Lastly, I wanted to end with this quote, which is looking at language acquisition. When acquiring another language, first we learn to listen. This is the underground work where they're just picking up vocabulary from listening. We learn to read what we've heard. We'll probably go into this in a different video, but usually students in an immersion program can decode the language so it looks like they're reading, but they may not be able to understand what they're reading. The more time they spend soaking up the language by listening and gaining vocabulary, the faster they'll gain that ability to understand what they're reading. As a side note, one thing you can do with your child is to work on techniques to figure out the meanings of words or phrases in a book by looking at pictures and using some logic. Okay, back to the quote. We learn to write what we've read and heard, and finally we speak because we've heard, read, and written it. Hope this has helped. Bye.